So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this third and sadly the last sessions we're going to have with Professor Verónica Rodríguez-Blanco. I want to thank everyone who's joining us online and also here at USP. Just to give a short introduction, Professor Verónica Rodríguez-Blanco is the chair of political philosophy and jurisprudence in the University of Surrey. She has a Bachelor of Law from the University of Caracas in Venezuela. Then she did a Master's in Philosophy in the Oxford University and a PhD in Cambridge. Oh, no, I think I changed it.
No, that's correct.
No, that's correct. The PhD was in Cambridge. So thank you very much. Here to comment and to react to Professor Veronica's talk, we're going to have Professor Gilberto Morbach. Professor Gilberto has a master's summa cum laude at Unicinos, Universidade do Vale dos Sinos, where he also got his PhD, and he was a visiting scholar at the Cambridge Forum for Legal Philosophy in the University of Cambridge. Also, we have Professor Carlos Frederico Ramos de Jesus. Professor Carlos is graduating from here. He also got his master's and his PhD here. He is a member of the Oxford Center for Animal Rights, is it? And he was also a contracted professor here some years ago, also in law and jurisprudence. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank Professor Reinaldo, Martin, Gilberto for the organization. With no further delay, Professor Veronica, you may have the floor.
Oh, thank you very much, Daniel. Just as Martin said this morning and last night, said this is the last dance. So I'm very sad about that, and hope it becomes the tango becomes a bolero later in life. Okay, so good. So in the first lecture, I was trying to demonstrate, I was trying to argue that Finney's remarks that there are three levels of explanation on common good is somehow correct, but needed a further interpretation. And I'm trying to develop this idea of the common good very much linked into practical reason and the possibility of a kind of Socratic dialogue in order to demonstrate the problems of liberalism and go a little bit further than the communitarian critique of liberalism. And as I mentioned in the beginning of this series of lectures, this is a large project that will take me some years. I hope we continue this conversation. And it's very much also related to the criticism of the concept of negative and positive freedom and external and internal freedom. And that will be the second part of the work. And I think some of the questions on the second part of the work that I'm still developing has been already raised. So I thank you very much for framing that for me in my thoughts. Yeah. So today I will continue with what I was trying also to demonstrate that the three levels of explanation, it seems confusing because in a way Finney has argued that actually the common good is merely instrumental. And I was trying to say that some people interpret this common good as instrumental, as if the common good were merely a spoon that we used to eat, or it's just a hammer to build things around, and it's just an instrumental thing. And I was trying to show that the instrumentality of the common good is connected to the basic good through what I call the process of practical reason. But the content of this sentence of what practical reason is where the complexity is. And I hope to keep developing that, right? It's where the difficulty is. It's not enough. And as students, I want you never be satisfied with people say, oh, this is all about practical reason. But what is that? How does it work? So keep digging, yeah? Keep doing your research and thinking, how does it really work? And specifically, in the world of examples, yeah, and counterexamples. So I was dealing with another interpretation of the common good, which the common good is just a ground view, something we all can grasp, something that the officials immediately apprehend. And in the last lecture, I was saying that this notion of the grand end, the common good as the grand end, it is helpful, and people argue in favor of it because it helps our guidance and it helps in justification. And I was saying that the problem is that you think that the common end as a grand end in substantive terms is justificatory, and that's its nature, that's problematic, because that means that actually there are principles. But I argue that these principles do not help us to explain how the subject transforms himself or herself towards what we call the civic maturity. I haven't fully unpacked that, but I think we can continue that conversation to what the subject, because the characteristic thing about practical wisdom and practical reason is that actually we constantly move through reasoning and the transformation of our desires. And I was saying the problem is the principles, people think that they are useful because they enable, right, to link the particular and the general, but doesn't say anything about us who are the thinkers and the ones who have desires towards the common good. So that's the fundamental gist of the lectures. So I hope now you can, those of you who didn't attend the lecture today, in Monday and Wednesday, can continue, and there is a coherence in my presentation today. So we continue with what I call the grand end view, and some possibilities of thinking how people think about the grand end view of the common good and why it's so problematic. So it's because a rejection of the idea that justification is the key to deliberate correctly about the common good. So arguably, what I call the bifurcation thesis and its corollary, the balancing model, tend to focus on the justification of the action. I should have said that as well. So I argue that most of the theories of rationality are grounded on the idea that on the one hand you have desires and the other side you have beliefs. And that we are kind of on the fence, measuring and balancing desires against desires, beliefs against beliefs, or beliefs against beliefs. That there is no synchronic or temporal aspect of the agency, and that it's possible to pin down or grasp immediately through what is called choice what you desire and what are the kinds of beliefs that enable you to reach that desire. And this is another underlying view that I'm trying to attack. So arguably, the bifurcation thesis and its corollary, the balancing model, tend to focus on the justification of the action. This means that as deliberators, officials need to focus on the connection between reasons for actions, internal or external, the means, and their connection to other means in certain ends to make sense of and justify their actions. This aspirational view's central idea is that we are thrust into the world and must decide. This means that officials are forced to make salient certain particularities of the world and grasp the community's particularities. The common good, as a grand end view, assumes that everything significant lies in the substantive and the what. However, my interpretative point about Aristotle is that he wants us to focus on the particular and the contingent as the objects of deliberation. We need a deliberative process that connects desires and emotions to intelligence and reasoning to truly grasp the complexity and richness of the particular. Starting the deliberation from the abstract, universal, given, and known, and then applying it to the particular instant bypasses the process of truly understanding the particular as unique. Therefore, in the case of the officials that aim to implement a health system, the grand end view assumes that the officials already understand the significance of the popularity of the population's health. The question that arises concerns the source or origin, or perhaps the mechanism of this particular piece of knowledge. Aristotle argues that we can only acquire this knowledge through experience, specifically the unique process of deliberating and thinking about our actions. The general idea of the what is straightforward. However, the challenge lies in defining the what in our lives, and for the officials, determining the what given the unique historical and institutional arrangements, capacities, limitations, the skills, and unique circumstances of their legal and political community. Justification necessitates framing the official's actions from the observer's or third point of view as we engage in the details of our actions. In other words, it presupposes that the official needs to see her action primarily from the third person perspective rather than the first person or deliberative point of view. But this is difficult to imagine psychologically. The assumption is that the official does not perceive the world, her community, its values, or the essential elements of the what when she is immersed in it. Instead, it necessitates constant attachment from officials and presumes that intelligence in deliberation primarily serves as justification. So the aspirational view of deliberation, on the other hand, rejects the idea that this forms the core of deliberation. Instead, it presents a more psychologically realistic depiction of the official's immersion in the world and their community and the resulting pressure to deliberate collectively. Fifth point on the common good as a grand end, a rejection of the view that we need a rational intuition of the common good as grand end. Is we follow Kraut in his defense of the grand end view, we can conclude that the grand end is clear for the deliberator and hence for the officials engaging in establishing the common good and the goods. One claim advantage of this view is that the good-based end is clear, which guides the officials in their actions. However, the ambiguity of the idea that intuition grasps the common good as grand end, or that this clear vision of the common good as grand end exists, is in the background, while officials deliberate and perform actions, limits the clarity of how this guidance operates. The challenge arises because the guidance must align with the particular's complexity and richness. The concept of rational intuition or the substantive end seems too passive and contemplative to explain how officials can break down the understanding of the grand end into the individual components of X, A, B, A1, and B1, while also aligning their desires and passion with these components. Finally, a close examination of our phenomenology during deliberation reveals that we are constantly revising, transforming, and changing ourselves and our projects, or the what. However, given the special status of the substantive end, is it possible to abandon the what? The grand end view portrays officials as obsessive and dogmatic characters who pursue the what, regardless of the community's traditions, history, circumstances, talents, skills, or limitations. Nonetheless, our experience tells us something else. Furthermore, we have stated that the guidance perspective, when considering the grand end, must establish principles that serve as a bridge between the official's lower desires and the grand end. Nevertheless, it remains unclear how these principles, if they emerge from reflection, will be connected to officials' lower desires. Conversely, if these principles stem from our experience and we endorse them and follow them, it indicates that we have likely already acquired the desires that we need to perform the correct or right actions, rendering principles or rules unnecessary for guidance. The role of principles or rule is justificatory only, and they play no role in guiding or deliberation and action. The aspirational view necessitates that we undergo a transformative process collectively, elevating our desires and emotions as we engage in intelligent thinking together about our actions. Kant and McIntyre, two key defenders of the grand end view, underestimate Aristotle's contribution to the idea of deliberation as a process of transformation through reason and thinking about how towards the what, while we strive to align our emotions and desires. Sixth point, a focus on the idea that the exercise of officials' capacity produces right answers, as opposed to a recognition capacity that recognizes when procedure has produced the right answers. So the contemporary conception of capacity suggests that we have the ability to reach the right answer on what we should do via reasons, but also need to recognize and understand this process. For instance, we have the capacity to establish a procedure to reach a foreign language to a child, a foreign language to a child. We begin with teaching the alphabet, basic grammar, vocabulary, and listening skills. However, at a later stage, it becomes imperative to recognize that this is the correct procedure, equipping the child with the necessary skills to learn a foreign language. The process of exercising a reasoning capacity encompasses both the development of the procedure and its subsequent recognition. Using the health system's previous example in a previous lecture, the officials deliberate and discover that X is composed of AB, A1, and B1. They now engage with A1 and B1, which are the actions closest to them. However, for the grand end view theories, an additional step is required. Officials need to recognize that this procedure is the correct one. And the grand end or substantive end will be the final indicator to recognize that doing X, A, B, A1, and B2 will lead to the substantive end, the what, which she has intuitively grasped. By contrast, according to the proposed Aristotelian-inspiring conception of deliberation, there is no need for the latter stage of recognition of a procedure. The officials exercise the capacity for decomposing or translating X into a set of feasible actions. There is no need to recognize or validate the procedure for correctness. However, does this mean that there is no reflection on the what and the how? Does this mean that there is no process of recognition? Recognition operates within the aspirational perspective of the mature and phronimos official. Further elaboration is necessary, but due to space constraints, I'm unable to do so here. The aspirational perspective admits that while we are exercising our capacity, we are also perceiving, learning to perceive, and acquiring insights, and that the quality of this learning depends on the quality of deliberation and rational decision prohairesis. Furthermore, the particulars of the action are its essence, as opposed to a product. Only the deliberative perspective allows us to perceive the particulars, and reflection enhances what we see. So now I'm going to discuss a potential objection to my criticism of the deliberative process. So, objection to the proposed notion. The proposal is a mere flowing of practical reason, and they are not truly objective good and common good. In this section, I address a potential objection to the Aristotelian-inspired model of the deliberative state, aspirational stance, and the arguments that aim to undermine the common good as a grand end. An objector may assert that practical reason is portrayed as a flow of our practical reasoning, leading to ambiguity and a lack of clarity regarding how we grasp objective good and the common good and become phronimos. Furthermore, the objector may argue that the proposal fails to address certain metaethical assumptions, resulting in a gap regarding the relationship between practical knowledge and objective goods, or rather between officials' practical reason and good simplicity. We can formulate one distinctive version of this objection, which is the following. I call it the Machiavellian style skepticism about practical reason. First, we can embrace a skeptical viewpoint, drawing inspiration from Machi's philosophy, which posits that the existence of objective goods and common good is absurd. According to this perspective, there is no good in the universe that can cause our actions qua normative. Put it simply, According to the deliberative aspirational model, officials engage in thinking about whether an end Y is good. And then after deliberating, they act to pursue Y. However, a Machiavellian objection may state that this is simply the mere flowing of officials' reasoning. There is no objective or factual existence of anything as good simplicity as part of the furniture of the universe. To assert that objective goods which dictate both the what and the how of my actions and an objective aspirational perspective cause the correctness of official thoughts and actions would be queer. Therefore, there is no such a thing as an aspirational perspective qua objective good. The deliberative aspiration approach merely represents the flowing of the official thought. Naturally, the critic may argue that we might acknowledge the notion that officials speak as if we are acting in accordance with the good and inhabiting an objective aspirational stance. However, this would only demonstrate that our ethical language is neither true nor false. Officials' ethical and moral concepts and terms do not refer to anything. The ethical and moral language are in error. Alternatively, the deliberative aspirational model collapses into a wholly subjective perspective. However, this kind of skepticism models the fundamental inquiry of practical reason, as if it were a matter of theoretical reason. The objection is fallacious, as it assumes that the sole kind of objectivity is limited to objectivity in theoretical reasoning. Allow me to elucidate. We can depict this image which emphasizes the naturalness of our thought and the pursuit of the good as follows. You immediately contemplate an end, Y, therefore you are ready to recommend it or desire it, leading to making Y occur through your bodily movements and your grasp of the means. This ethical quality resides within you, requiring no transformation of your desires, emotions, and passions. Moreover, every individual has this inherent quality of immediately apprehending the good, the rightful, and the dutiful inside themselves. If this were a genuine possibility at all, the sole requirement for action will be the grasping of objective goods followed by the physical motion of our body. However, this will be the opposite of practical reason. Based on this image, there is no need for practical reason's mediation. Unlike theoretical reasoning and any possible reduction of practical reason to theoretical reason, as just recently discussed, practical reason's inquiry seeks to establish the character and substance of the standard of the particular action. Only by settling the series of actions connecting the indeterminate end and the means to it, as outlined in the aspirational deliberative model, can one determine the objective good which serves as a standard of practical reason in ethical action. The indeterminate end is comprised of components whose basic elements determine the initiation of the action. Once we start acting, the indeterminate end illuminates the how of the action, and vice versa. It is a constant flowing of our reasoning that includes the transformation of our character. As a result, any objection to robust practical reason must consider the suggested arguments as structure, while refraining from imposing the structure and methods of theoretical reasoning. A Machiavellian objection prevents any interpretation of reasoning as involving the interaction of desires, including emotions and passions, and reason, which is precisely what has been proposed. According to the proposed model, practical reasoning is thinking and is settling what the good is in relation to the how of the action. A Machiavellian argument asserts that it will be queer to postulate an entity in the world that will cause the pursuit of our actions to be a practical necessity. However, Machiavelli's argument assumes that the mind, beliefs, or thoughts can immediately grasp the objective good, thereby leading to action as a practical necessity or imperative requirement, specifically what I ought to do or I ought to pursue. In contrast to this position, my core argument is that our inherent animal nature compels us to engage with the particularity and contingency of our actions. However, we can also elevate ourselves to an aspirational perspective, transforming our desires, passions, and emotions through their alignment with our thoughts about what is good, beautiful, and rightful. The journey towards a more aspirational perspective is neither a sudden leap nor an immediate apprehension of an ethical reality, but rather a constant and diachronic shift of a stance or perspective through interactions with others and engagement with evaluative concepts and ethical language. As a result is a legal and political activity. Our ethical and legal language, along with its respective practices, constitute a thick web that does not have an external reference beyond its form, logical connections, or internal structure. As a result, the theoretical distinction between subjective and objective viewpoints is equally artificial. This distinction is predominantly intelligible when we are engaging with theoretical reasoning. Let us suppose that we investigate a virus's cellular structure. If our theoretical framework or the scientist's beliefs are the sole factor determining the character of the virus's cellular structure, the statements are subjective. Arguably, the cell's structure is merely a construction of our theoretical framework and hence subjective, as we have no empirical evidence supporting the reality of the virus's cellular structure. In contrast, if we assert that the cell's structure genuinely exists in the universe, then the virus's DNA sequence is not only a mere construct, but rather a fact, as evidenced by our experiments. Hence, this statement is an objective statement. Practical reason, in contrast to theoretical reason, does not depict anything in this way. It aims to establish the series of reasonable actions that will lead us to what is good, beautiful, and rightful. So according to robust practical reason and the proposed Aristotelian-inspired deliberative aspirational model, the objectivity or standard of excellence is ascertained by the abilities of human beings that have learned to see the good. This model assumes that we possess the ability to transform ourselves and act accordingly. In our example of health, it is the officials learning to see the good while they are deliberating and engaging with health as the common good. How of the action and health as good, the what of the action. However, a critic could contest this view, arguing that evolutionary biology demonstrates that we are merely physical biological entities, our physical form and cognitive function subject to scientific laws and principles. Within a scientific paradigm, how we learn to transform ourselves to become good remains mysterious. However, we are rejecting this scientific paradigm in our pursuit of what is good. No scientific study of human acts can anticipate an answer to the good question in concrete situations. No science can fulfill this demand. It conflicts with the fundamental character of human existence. Conclusions. Reflections on common good as both instrument and part of the internal structure of the plurality of the goods. So in the first lecture, I introduced the idea that the common good of a political community is both instrumental and internal to the structure of the plurality of goods. Therefore, it is correct to view the common good as merely instrumental and to view it as an object or grand end that a political community strives to achieve. Furthermore, I discussed G. Moore's idea that good for him or her is not different from good simpliciter, and that the good as a former idea enables us to formulate the question, is this good and why, when we are faced with particular actions? The good is like the sun. It illuminates the process of deliberation and practical reasoning, but it's not the object of practical reason. It illuminates the plurality of goods such as justice, freedom, autonomy, self-determination, friendship, life, health, religiosity, marriage, and so on. I try to argue that this is not an empirical assertion, but rather the way we structure our thinking and guide all our actions, including the building of political and social institutions. This plight of the inexorability of the good means that we need to determine the good of the action and take an aspirational perspective, transforming ourselves or avoiding taking the aspirational viewpoint, leading to irrational action or effective exercise of practical reasoning. I have demonstrated via negativa that the common good as a grand end is implausible, as it contradicts the way we operate and engage our practical capacities. I have demonstrated that the good as instrumental is internal to the plurality of the good, and its internal relationship emerges as discovery or achievement through practical deliberation or prohairesis. This demonstration via negativa aims also to indirectly show that the question of whether the right can be detached from the good is misleading and artificial. The primary question that I pose to creatures like us, human beings, is this good and why? Thank you so much for listening to all this.
So thank you, Professor Veronica, very much. And now to comments and reactions, we shall start with Professor Gilberto Morbach.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for being here. It is a huge honor and a huge responsibility for me to be here today, and I will try my best to be up to this task this morning. Please allow me to start by thanking Martin Petis and Daniel Damian, my dear colleagues and friends, for the organization of this lecture series. My special thanks also goes to Professor Carlos Frederico. It is a huge pleasure to share this morning with such a qualified colleague. I would also like to express my gratitude to Professor José Reinaldo de Lima Lopes, who personifies everything that I want to be as an academic and as a human being as well. So let me salute also Professor Dimer Flores, who's here with us, Professor Ronaldo. I'm very glad to see you here, Professor Daniel Murata. Special salutation also to my students who are here, Rodrigo, Isabella. Very nice to see you here. And last, but definitely not least, I would like to thank Professor Verónica Rodríguez-Blanco for taking the long flight to Brazil, for these excellent lectures, and for her generosity and kindness with us along this week, which cannot be taken for granted. I should also mention that particularly praiseworthy is Professor Veronica's philosophizing itself. Her approach is also sun-like because it illuminates that there is a different way of doing philosophy. She's interested more in connections and relations than with dichotomies and separation. I applaud that, I learned from it, and it makes me appreciate all the more this opportunity today. So my comment today will be divided into three separate questions I'd like to pose to Professor Veronica. The first two are more closely related, or this is what I'd like to argue. And the third one is more of an intellectual curiosity. One premise of my questions is the following. I believe Professor Veronica is right in her rejection of the grand end view of the common good. And I believe her challenge from practical reason is also inexorable for those who seek to defend such a conception after her powerful objections. However, I think that some things should be said once one of the focuses here is official action. So my first question goes as follows. According to Professor Veronica, the grand end view cannot account for officials' lower desires unless principles and rules are established. As she herself points out, quite correctly, officials, people as they are, can be greedy, egoistical, self-interested. I am still not sure how the deliberation approach, persuasive as it is as an account of how practical reason works, can account for the problem of wicked officials. I agree that correctly understood, the how and the what interact in practical reason properly understood. But what if officials simply don't care? What if they are just not interested in undergoing a transformative process collectively? This is not note a Mackey-style objection, because I myself do not question the objectivity of goodness. I do question, however, if Professor Veronica's view can work without a theory of the virtues. I do not mean a wholesale embrace of virtue ethics. But I wonder if we can think beyond the more pessimistic liberal approaches without a theory of virtues, but the virtues that we are entitled to expect of legal officials in their official capacity. I agree that self-interested, wicked officials are exercising our practical reason defectively. But if we are to reject the less demanding justification and legitimacy-based approaches, such as the liberal ones, can one do without the virtues? And this is so because I do not think only that wicked officials are defective in their exercise of practical reason. I also think that they are defective as legal officials. But not only because of the virtues they lack, but because I believe that law itself, as a distinctive practice, does not function as law if their operations are taken as a mere instrument for self-interested ends. This leads me to my second question. I'm sorry. In one of the Q&A sessions, Professor Veronica said that there are things that only the law can do. Among these, and I quote, "The law invites the person to be a mature citizen." That is quite interesting. So I'd like Professor Veronica to expand on that in the following sense. What are the jurisprudential entailments of your view, Professor? I mean, to put it differently, does your approach presupposes a different, specific way of conceiving of law as a distinctive practice? How does your view of the common good and social institutions? Okay, if you need a pen, there's one right here. So, how does your view of the common good and social institutions, your view of practical reason itself, relates to the concept of legality, of the rule of law, the very concept of law itself, in the way we come to grasp and understand it? Finally, and as a mere curiosity, I would raise a third question, a very quick one. Professor Veronica poses a very interesting response to Murphy's approach. I would like to know how she feels Jonathan Crow's approach to the common good, as he argues for a multidimensional account, combining instrumental, distinctive, and aggregative understandings of the concept. The specific reason why I bring Crow into the conversation is in the following passage of his, and I quote. He says that political philosophy, in other words, takes place against the backdrop of practical reason. The role of practical reason in this context is first to provide baseline constraints on the scope of permissible political action and institutional design, and second, to highlight basic values and reasons that must be taken into account. Now, the requirements of practical reason, in turn, are the product of hermeneutic engagement with the social contexts with which we are familiar. The basic goods, in this sense, set constraints upon the common good, but they are themselves a product of our best interpretation of our social environment. There is, therefore, a dialectical interplay in political philosophy between the basic goods and the common good, where each is at least partially constitutive of the other. So Crow's allusion to practical reason and to a hermeneutic engagement and to a dialectical interplay, all of these are reminiscent somewhat of the present discussion. So I think it would be valuable to hear Professor Veronica's response to his approach. So these are my quick questions for today, and I cannot overstate how grateful I am for the opportunity, Professor Veronica, to discuss with you, who I now admire even more than I already did, and for everyone that is here present with us today. So thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you so much, Gilberto. These are very, very difficult observations and challenging. So we'll try, they will give me a lot of thinking for what I'm trying to develop. So I will just try to address it now very quickly to think together about this. So the first question is quite interesting. So do you think that the wicked official will say something, well, I don't care about this, the transformation process, no? Or I don't, so
it's not even willing to engage in the process as such.
Yeah, correctly, yes. So this is the point. I think that what I'm trying, I mentioned the book is forthcoming in May with 3 chapters on practical reason. And there, I'm trying to explain precisely how the problem of the wicked officials indirectly works, right? So I'm saying that I analyze what is called the acratic behavior. So the acratic behavior is when there is no alignment of your thinking. Yes. So, yes, when there is no alignment of your thinking with your desires, right? So what the acratic does is that, I give you an example. The law of negligence presents to you as an employer that you ought to actually give to your employees goggles to protect their eyes because they are working with chemicals. So I'm arguing what the judge, the common law, in a particular case, is giving you a descriptions of values for your actions. So the judge in the common law is not only sorting out the problem of a physical injury that an employer, as a vicariously liable, has caused to the employee, but also is telling to the future employers and to all the employers in the political and legal community that they actually have to give some measures to protect their employees. Now, the employer can take this point as an acratic and say, well, I don't want to inhabit this aspirational point. I see no point. What I'm going to say is I'm going to omit the regulation, this imposition of this duty imposed by the common law. And this is a kind of, it's not wicked yet, because the characteristic of the acratic is that there's no alignment of emotions, right, in a way, and the practical thinking, yeah? He's a kind of indifference. There is no complete non-awareness. There is an awareness, but there is a kind of indifference to it. Now, what happens with a wicked official? The wicked official says, well, this employer will think in this way, yeah? It's not that I don't care about inhabiting this description of value in which I have to engage, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to put even more chemicals here for my employees because I really enjoy it, yeah, that their eyes are damaged, and I'm going to actually fire them. So I'm giving an implausible example, but to see the difference between the acratic and the wicked. So a characteristic of the wicked is that the wicked enjoy the evil or the bad act, right? So I think the account can give an explanation. So the thing is that you refused, yeah? You don't want to inhabit that space. Stanley Cavell gives a beautiful example. I modified it so it's more illustrative, yeah? So imagine in the 18th century, in a certain country I'm not going to mention, there is a slavery, right? And the children of this slave owner play with the children of the slave. So the slave owner think in his thought is that this slave is a good man, a good hunter, and a good humor, has an excellent humor, but the only space that he refuses to give to this slave is the space of freedom. So this is another example in which it's not that good and evil is optional to me from this point of view. Is that when you don't take certain stance or space or perspective, I call it in the book, then actually that's where the wicked aspect becomes. Yeah, it's not that you choose to be bad. It's that there is a space of justice that he refuses to give to us, to the freedom, space of freedom and liberty. Yeah. So, but he interacts with a delight way. Yeah. He thinks he's human in all forms, but there is one space, and that is another aspect in which practical reason is effective. So when you refuse to inhabit some perspectives, I'm trying to argue in the book, and that connected to and the law invites you to connect this, is exactly when you are actually exercising in the effective way. The problem of, I think this is where you're getting into, and I don't radical leave. It's not the bad man, it's the radical leave. That's another matter. I don't understand it. Yeah, but that has to be done. Okay, the second point. So I'm not saying that you don't need a theory of the virtues, right? Yeah. But my problem with some philosophical thinking is that you put sometimes the cart before the horses, or you combine things, but they are not in the right way. So to do a theory of the virtues without understanding the complexity of practical reason is to muddle the waters. So this is a theory of virtues. Yeah, and I think it's an Aristotelian Thomist conception of virtue, but it's not yet. It's more about practical reason, because it's about how we do things, how we do evil, bad, and good, and not that good, and how we grow. And that is the point of the character of the virtue. And it's intellectualist because it says you can only do it through what we call the philosophical method of dialogical conversations with the others in the political and legal community, and we do it through reasoning. So you're right in saying, impressing me, but I want to understand better the virtue of the theory of virtues, but I can only do things one at a time. No, so I think you're right. There should be something further here on the theory of the virtues connected to these. I owe that to you. Yes, I have to do that. And then, yeah, and that question is linked to the problem of legality.
Yeah.
And that's very difficult, yes, because, and how you, so the practical reason is the mature citizen, but the mature citizen is the ideal, yeah? And the mature citizen is the one who is willing to inhabit this aspiration. It's the slave owner who can inhabit, say, no, this man deserves freedom. Or the one that the employer who is aware, this is a description of values that I ought to embrace, that I ought to do. So it's what I call proleptic reasoning. And proleptic reasoning is because what someone tells you is going to be part of your practical reasoning in your future action. You're not convinced yet, but you can start, that can become an indeterminate end of yours in the particular description of the action, in the Anscombe sense, description of an action. And I'm talking a description of a value for the action. So in the Anscombian sense, yeah. And then you start to think about the means and the ends. And about the rule of law, did you ask something about the rule of law, or is it because your research, I just put it in your mouth?
The concepts are related, and I wanted to see how your presuppositions in your understanding of practical reason, if there are any entailments to the way we conceive of law and the rule of law and the related concepts such as legality. And so, I mean, can we adopt any conception of law that is adequate to your conception of practical reason, or does this conception of practical reason necessarily presupposes that we understand law itself differently as well?
Okay, good. So I usually say this to the students. So the first positivist is Thomas Aquinas, no? That he says you ought to posit, yeah, law is an act, yeah, promulgated according to reason for the common good. This is the most complex sentence ever. So what is to promulgate is an act. You posit an act, right? And that for reason, for practical reason, according to the common good, well, probably this conception of the common good. So then becomes, yes, positivism is right. Yes, it's something we do and we posit and we present it publicly. Yeah, it's publicly ascertainable. But the publicly ascertainable is not as straightforward. It's through practical reason. That is the challenge. We think we understand it, we grasp it, it's intuitive. That comes from the scientific viewpoint, from the naturalism, but it's enormously complex and entails so I don't know how to call it this, but it's closer probably to the classical conception of
I think so,
natural, because practical reason is the core of everything. Yes. That is a very important question. Thank you.
Thank you.
And your third question, okay, that's I don't know this Jonathan Crow's work. I heard so much, and I heard it's wonderful, and I heard also that you're inviting him. I wish I were here. It will be a luxury to be with him. So from this passage, I just not convinced. How can be multidimensional? You can have everything
because
in life.
they're rival conceptions, right?
Correctly.
Yeah. Okay.
And this seems to me it's a pragmatism. Yeah, this guise of lateral law. I hope, Jonathan, you're not there listening to this. But I just want to understand better. Yeah, this. And I think I hope he unpacks this, because this is too fast.
Okay.
Yeah. This is too much. What is dialectical? What is hermeneutical? How is it in context? What does it mean, all that? Yes. Thank you very much. You press me on this. This is something I need to work on as well. I need to engage with other authors as well. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Professor Carlos Frederico.
So good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, an honor. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of these very fruitful lectures, which have brought us so many rich reflections. Thank you, Professor José Reinaldo, who was my supervisor in master's and in PhD, with whom I have learned so much. Thank you, Professor Gilberto Morbach, Martin Petis, Daniel Damian, brilliant colleagues with whom I share many research interests. And I'd like also to greet Professor Guilherme de Almeida, my supervisor in postdoctoral research, Professor Ronaldo, Professor Imer Flores from UNAM, Professor Daniel Murata. And thank you a lot, Professor Veronica, for this extremely instigating, insightful, and original thoughts that you have generously shared with us during this week. Your lectures have offered us an account of common good, and of deliberation, which poses many questions to prevailing traditions. They present a different vocabulary, different concepts, and distinct conceptions of concepts generally understood in other senses in the realm of liberal tradition. This approach to common good and deliberation, inspired by Aristotelian and Neo-Aristotelian thought, invites us to see our political and moral problems from a new perspective. Also, Professor Veronica, your attention to issues such as practical reasoning and practical wisdom are also of utmost importance in law school. I really wish all the students had seen your lectures and had read your article. It's good that they will have the opportunity to do so in the recorded videos in the YouTube, because this is a subject matter without which one isn't able to be a lawyer, a judge, or prosecutor, at least a good one. No? One doesn't have to be interested in researching or teaching to recognize the practical impact of these themes in legal practice. So as a lawyer and as a legal scholar, I have learned a lot from you. My comments have one big question, but divided in 3 themes, and 2 very punctual and, let's say, small questions. So this first big question is about justification, third-person perspective, and the recognition. So I quote, starting the deliberation from the abstract, universal, given, and known, and then applying it to the particular instance, bypasses the process of truly understanding the particular as unique, end of quote. This is certainly true if one thinks that the general rule determines the particular, which would be a miscomprehension of how practical reasoning works. In this process, you attribute to justification the role of connecting, if I have read it right, reasons, means, and the decision. But nonetheless, deliberation in the aspirational model and not in the balancing model will also need to be justified. So following the example of public officers deciding about health facilities and health policies, they will need to give reasons to the community they serve, explaining why they have decided to hire 5 and not 10 doctors, why they have built those facilities in one way and not another, why they have chosen professionals for such specialties and not from others, and so on. Even if we imagine that they are committed to the aspirational model of deliberation and not to the balancing model, they will be called to give reasons about their decisions. So my question, aren't these reasons properly justifications? In other words, does justification have a place in the aspirational model, or is it doomed? And if it's doomed, what other concept or conception of reason given does the same job that justification does in the balancing model? So a similar question arises, and that's the second part of the big question, from the rejection of third-person perspective. You write, quote, justification necessitates framing the official's actions from the observer's or third-person point of view as we engage in the details of our actions. In other words, it presupposes that the official needs to see her action primarily from the third-person perspective rather than the first-person or deliberative point of view. But this is difficult to imagine psychologically. The assumption that the official does not perceive the world, her community, its values, or the essential elements of the what when she is immersed in it. End of quote. So third-person perspective is deemed as psychologically improbable because who decides is always embedded in circumstances of a particular problem, is always attentive to traditions, values, and perceptions specific of her community or her group. Okay, it's certainly impossible for me to decide something in spite of being me, in spite of being myself. The individual is always the agent who takes responsibility for actions and decisions. But I wonder, how can decisions of public officers be accountable for the community? Third-person perspective is not a reality, but a moral device, an artifice for impartiality, generality, universalizability. So it's a test for the officers, and we could say for any moral agent, to ask themselves, would anyone in my position, in this case, with this context, decide the way I am deciding? Third-person perspective, thus, functions as a test for shared reasons. And those shared reasons are certainly important when we think about common good. So, and then this is finally the second part to sum up. Which concept would play the same function of impartiality, generality, and universalizability in the aspirational model of deliberation? Which moral device would have the same role that third-person perspective has in the balancing model? So the third part of the big question, there's another question connected to these concerning the recognition of a good decision by an officer. You say that in the grand end view, after a decision is made, it should be recognized by a procedure that states that the substantive end was achieved. In the view of the deliberation that you propose, quote, there is no need for the latter stage of recognition of a procedure, end of quote, because, quote, recognition operates within the aspirational perspective of the mature and phronimos official. Further elaboration is necessary, end of quote. So, enjoying this further elaboration, I would like to ask how this recognition can be institutionalized by law, if it can. Since legal requirements of compliance and accountability served by the procedures in the balancing model are of great importance in actions by public officers. Indeed, the validation procedures of decisions are of utmost importance to assess if a public policy has reached its goals, which are deeply connected with the good and the rights they aim to promote. So now I turn to my two last small and specific points and questions. The first is about the nature of the good and the nature of the common good. You deny that it is subjective, for it can't be whatever people happen to want, and that it is also denied that good can be objectively grasped as if it were within the things, an empirical thing. Could we say, that's my question, that good and common good are reflexive and relational? So that is, they exist only in the relation between individuals or groups and the objects or states of things that are good for them. So instead of objective or subjective, good would be reflexive and relational. I wonder if this portrays accurately the nature of the good in your account. And the second and last point is about one of the last sentences of the text. Quote, this demonstration via negativa aims also to indirectly show that the question of whether the right can be detached from the good is misleading and artificial, end of quote. So how would you rewrite, according to your theory, and that's more of an intellectual curiosity as well, Rawls' statement that justice draws the limit and the good shows the point? So Rawls recognizes that right and good are complementary, but they play different roles in deliberation and in the political life. So they are detached in his conception, except that primary goods should entail basic rights. So that's more of a curiosity. How would you rewrite this sentence about the right, justice, and the good? Thanks again for your wonderful contributions, and I have learned a lot.
Oh, this is wonderful. Thank you very much. So much. Let me see. Okay, so and I like it because you're coming from a completely different tradition. So very grateful for this. Yes, because it helped me to clarify my own thoughts. So one of your points is, well, this is all perfect. You have the aspirational, the deliberation, but you still need to account to all of them. Yes. So in a way, there are two ways of interpreting their point. One is that, can you explain to them your own process of your first person perspective process, how you connected the means and the ends, and why this end was reshaped through the means and then was presented as it is, this health, this infrastructure, this training of nurses and doctors. The other is the one I'm rejecting, the second interpretation, is that the justification, yeah, is done as a merely result of the balancing process. These are the reasons, yeah, because training the doctors in this way is a belief, because training the doctors in this other way is in conflict, and you can do an utilitarian calculation, cost-benefit analysis, or you can do a kind of a reflective equilibrium on the roles, where you look for the consistency and coherence of the principles with the moral judgments and the considerations. But in the latter case, there's no conception of the good and no transformation of the officials. So the justification, there are two stages. One is the forward-looking aspect, which is the deliberative point of view. That is transparent, there is non-observational, you engage with the world, so the world is presented to you in the form of a value or the good, and you are not thinking about the object in a theoretical way from the third point of view, but the object is presented to you, and you are trying to define how the object is related to other objects, or how the persons are related to other persons, and that comes back to the relational aspect, in order to shape this good that is indeterminate. And there's the backward-looking aspect. Then you are asked, how did you use forward-looking process? And again, in my book, I explain that how corrective justice works, because the corrective justice account of tort law is that when there is a relationship between right and duty, between the right of the defendant and the duty of the plaintiff who has harmed the victim in the tort relationship. And I'm arguing that this is a correct account of relationship in rights and duties, but it's only a justificatory account done by the judge that is parasitic on the forward-looking account. So the judge has to imagine how the citizens are going to engage in the practical reason themselves, and how the descriptions of values are going to operate. And then when he is asked to justify, he writes in the backward-looking perspective. So he will use the doctrinal work, he will use the whole right conception to justify his decision. I think I will send you my book with the 3 chapters where I explain that. But I think this expands to all the aspects of public policies. You say that, can you clarify something here? You say that the procedures justify the decision, right? But then you are assuming the procedures, and you mean the reflective equilibrium process.
Yes, that would be about the section 2.6 of your text, when you say that after the decision is made for the balancing model, there's still another point, another checkpoint, which would be this procedure validation, this recognition that the ends were met. Correct. And then you say, well, this is not necessary in my aspirational model. And I'm asking, what plays the role of this validation, for accountability, for compliance, to see if the ends of the public policy, of the public action were effectively met.
Yeah, I understand now. So yes, so the point is, in the forward-looking perspective, when there is an engagement of deliberation, the X and the Y connected, and then in backward and forward process of reasoning, where there is then there is a translation of that process in the backward-looking, but it's not a procedure that recognizes.
I see.
Yeah. Because that correctly,
So
because my problem is that you don't need a process of recognition, because you have developed the capacities, and the presumption, and this is the beauty, I think, is that the citizen, some mature citizens, law-abiding citizens, will recognize it as well. You see, the process of forward-looking, but there will be ones outliers. Absolutely. And they are refusing, and this is going back to your point, they're refusing to occupy that stance. And there will be always. So you don't need a process of recognition. So, okay, so moral device. Okay, that's good. So you think that, yeah, the third person perspective. So I think I have to explain a little bit more. So the third person perspective presupposes this. So I'm going to concentrate only on action now. So from the first person perspective, you're engaging in an action, yes? So let us suppose I go downstairs to my kitchen to make a cappuccino machine, a cappuccino, right? I put on the machine, I make a cappuccino, but just by accident, I make a black coffee. Because I am the cause of what I understand, I have settled the reasons of what I'm doing. It means that I'm going downstairs, I want to have a delicious coffee in order to give me energy during the day. It has to be a cappuccino because of the balance of the milk and the coffee. All these, of course, in the past, I have reasoned in this way, or my mother has told me this way, and it's presented, I'm giving you an easy example. It's presented as, it's not that I'm stopping every time that, what do I want? What should I do? This is done naturally, but because of the kind of capacities I have developed, right? So I do the cappuccino machine, and then by accident, I do an espresso instead. Why do I correct my performance according to my aim, which was a cappuccino and not an espresso? So this is the first person perspective. Then I suppose you're standing in the kitchen and you think, oh no, Veronica is actually sleeping. Yes, it's 5 in the morning. No, this is your attribution is that actually I do not really desire, I really desire no coffee whatsoever. That is the third person perspective. So this is in the theory of action, right? And I argue that is most of the understanding of action in the case of the employer in the law. Yeah, I'm doing mainly private law. In most of the actions, when we talk about intentional action, recklessness, negligence, yeah, most of the theories describe the action from the third person perspective. Yes. And the problem is that they're attributing mental states of desires and beliefs, and they don't understand how truly the agent engages with the world. Yeah, I gave you an example which is almost a parody. Yeah, but that I'm arguing that most of the accounts of action in law, they try to reduce the first person perspective, which is enormously rich and complex, to the third person perspective. And this is my worry. Now, my question is, I'm saying probably when we're trying to justify in the balancing way, we are just attributing value. We're just attributing principles. We are throwing, it's like you're throwing, jelly in the wall to see what sticks. You're not really understanding the structure of thinking of the first person perspective. So I'm saying that it's of course, I know if it's a moral device, it's a wrong moral device. And well, I haven't said this, but Stanley, the guy in Harvard, Sandel says this view presupposes a nominal self, and self whether the good is not constitutive of who we are. And this is exactly the problem.
Liberalism, the limit of justice.
Correctly. But I didn't want to get into that vocabulary. But if this is the vocabulary where I understand it. Exactly. So here, when you describe the coffee, you say, oh no, she's really sleepwalking. She doesn't want to have a coffee. She's just throwing things into me. Yes,
Mhm, mhm,
because you are in the nominal self.
mhm.
You don't understand how the goods are constitutive of myself. I wake up in the 5 in the morning to study, to have an espresso machine. You was just guessing my house. You don't understand the complexity of my process of deliberation. Now, maybe you just, if you stop me and you say, stop, Veronica, what are you doing? I said, don't you see? Carlos, I'm having a coffee to wake up in the morning. Oh, it's 5 in the morning. What are you doing? Oh, I'm going to read Reynaldo's books. Yes. Okay, great. Yeah. And now it makes sense. I'm only arguing. It's a very simple argument. I only argue this is the point of view. You have to make sense of everything. Don't start from this moral device, because then you lose all of us. Yes, you lose the working class, you lose the farmer, you lose the nurse, you lose the doctor, you lose the professors, you're losing everyone. Of course, then you can present to the community the moral device, and you have a reflective, you can do all the things. But actually, all the things are parasitic on the point of view of the deliberative point of view. And the other problem that I have with that, you say, oh, it's a shared good. Well, it's a shared good, but it's not the right good in the particular circumstances. Because I'm saying only developing the transformation of yourself, you can actually develop the right good, or the dutiful, or the beauty from the first person perspective. So it's shared, but in a very special way. It's shared through a rational engagement of all of us in the transformation of all of us. You have 2 questions now. Okay, so the good decision, we did that, the procedure. So the 2 questions, is reflective and relational. Yes, you don't want to learn new vocabulary as we discussed today. Someone said that. Do you like that? But as long as you preserve the first person point of view, you're right. So you want me to rephrase roles. What about this? The good is unveiled through deliberation. And in that way, the good illuminates justice. Justice is not only a limit, it's more than just, something like that. But let me think. It's a good invitation. Love
Great.
it. Thank you very much. You agree, or you want to object, or do you want to object, or you're not convinced about my examples?
No, I'm pretty much convinced, and I like very much the good illuminates justice. The good is unveiled through
practical reason or deliberation.
Deliberation, the good illuminates justice. I just wonder if your example about the cappuccino and the espresso, about the first person, if it would apply also for public actions of public officers that should be justified for everyone, and not just for yourself.
Correctly.
If you want a cappuccino or an espresso, yes, whatever is whatever you want is good at that time. But when it comes to justify the actions for thirds, well, does the same apply?
Absolutely.
So
you're absolutely right. And this is what I'm trying also to develop. So we're having a workshop in Georgetown on collective questions on collectivity. Yes. So what I think I'm going to try to argue on that is I'm trying to show that it's through a process of conversation, and it's at the level of the union, of the church, of the community. So it's a process of conversation. And that is exactly what the common law does. Within the jurisdiction, a set of judges and courts that engage in this process. So the collectivity is not done by an ontology of a collective mind, but a communality and inequality, because I take seriously your thoughts. And I transform myself through your thoughts, and you transform yourself through my thoughts, in search of the question, is this good and why?
So it's not a third person, but a many first person.
Correctly.
Because thinking together.
Correctly. So I say, is it a political point? So when we have this conversation, I take you as my equal, because I believe that you have this rational capacity, like myself, of engaging, and then our emotions will encounter. When this does not happen, is that, of course, there is violence, right? Yeah, I invade you, and I punch you, or just shout at you, or tell you to shut up.
Thank you.
So can we have a later Q&A?
Yes, please.
Okay. So
not like this, no more, please. Right. I think that the presentation has to be done from the roles point of view. from the Jonathan Crow, from Taylor. So more conversations with others, I think. Yeah.
Perguntas? Renato? Professor Ronaldo, Professor José Reinaldo. Okay.
Okay. Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Renato. First of all, thank you to the researchers and professors who made this event possible. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. My question is not a question per se, is more of a clarification. You write that we can elevate ourselves to an aspirational perspective, transforming our desires, passions, and emotions through their alignment with our thoughts about what is good, dutiful, and rightful. I was wondering, is your claim that through a bit of theoretical reasoning about what is good, dutiful, and rightful, we can change our emotions and desires? Is that the claim? And do we need that? So we would need a bit of theoretical reasoning and practical reasoning in order to change these desires and passions.
Yeah, that's a good question. So yes, you're right. People think that when I argue in favor of philosophy, this is about theoretical reasoning. But what I'm arguing is that I'm going to pose questions to you with premises. So what we're here doing, so Renato, so you are going to have, we're going to have, let's say, a conversation about about health. You're a minister of health, you're an actor. And we start to have a conversation about what are the most common non-infectious diseases in the population. And you explain me, and we are relying on theoretical reasoning, but it's towards action. And our conversation, though it seems like practical, it seems like theoretical, because I'm trying to understand, we are also moving towards each other in agreeing. Let's say I'm the prime minister of this country, you are the health minister. We're trying to reach an agreement on what are going to be the kind of policies. We ask a set of experts about a set of facts, but it's all in our engagement between you and me, and the policies we're going to implement it is actually practical reasoning. So you're right, most of the people understand, because of the economists and microeconomics, we think that practical reasoning is a bunch of actors in cooperation, looking for the self-interest of maximizing or rationalizing. Or practical reasoning is the Kantian style that is a form of the categorical imperative, where you disregard the good of the particular and is presented to you in the form of universal will. I'm trying, this is practical reason, because you are undermining my premises. That's why it's so difficult. That's why we need the king philosopher doing the practical reasoning, because it engages the humility. I'm humble to you. I'm talking about the ideal way of performing it. I'm humble to your knowledge. You're humble to the way I see in my vision, and we reach together something to implement a small policy in the next 5 years of leading. So that's the idea. Your other question, what is the role of contemplation? Yeah, what they call contemplation. But I don't think that Aristotle and Plato mean contemplation looking or being abstraction from the world. Well, yes, Plato probably, right? Because the guardians have to be forced to come to lead, yeah, in the city. And once they have seen the form, one argument, some reading is that this has to be compulsory. They have to come. So that's why the vice chancellor of this university has to be someone who doesn't want to lead, precisely, because he doesn't want that power. So we have forgotten that this is all about transforming each other. So the question on contemplation and the role of practical reason in the political life is a very difficult question. Yeah. And on that, I recommend a recent book published by Dominic Scott, Contemplation in Plato and Aristotle, and he reached different conclusions for both. Yeah, he thinks the contemplation in Plato is instrumental, whereas for Aristotle is an end in itself. In the political community, that's interesting. So this is probably what I'm trying to argue in the Platonic way. Contemplation is political. Contemplation is instrumental. You have to come to the city and rule. Mhm. And the philosopher can be, but has to be well trained in truth. Mhm. I can't believe I'm saying this. You are pushing me. Hire more philosophers. You can tell your ministers, no? If the advisories or during the COVID period would have been the philosophers, we would have a different outcome, I think.
Well, thank you, Veronica. My question is basically a demand for more clarification. It's a kind of follow-up from what Renato was telling. Of course, the distinction between practical reason and theoretical reasoning is quite well known, quite well established in the Occidental philosophy. However, I would like to know whether you think there's some kind, is this a matter of an essential difference or more like a matter of degree, in the sense that, and I'm asking this because, I mean, there are many contemporary philosophers, and I'm especially thinking about Wittgenstein, who in a way once rooted all philosophy, all knowledge in some kind of action, some kind of, the motto in the beginning was the deed, as some kind of rooting all kind of way of thinking in some practical stand. This kind of perspective has sometimes been called the practical turn in philosophy. I would like to know you more about, it seems that you are using the counter in a more strict, in a more narrower sense. So I'd like to listen to you more about this.
Yeah, this is very interesting. So the question, so I'm advocating for practical reason in the classical way, and I'm giving a spin and a way of thinking how this really works for law, knowing the way, and more specifically private law. But you're right. So there was a lot of metaphysics done, and the contribution of Wittgenstein start with the power of language games. And the first example in the philosophical investigation is what he thinks is Augustine theory of reference. And then he thinks it's like a child, and he imagines this first example, a child coming to the new world, and there are labels in these objects, and there is the presumption is that there is a clear connection between these objects in these labels and the meaning immediately. So the child, and he demonstrates through another example, is more like, for example, when there is a building and one of the workers shout, "Give me that brick." Then the meaning of that brick is understanding. And this leads also to the question of how we see things. So in the rabbit duck case, you have two images, but it seems so strange to us, the duck rabbit case, because there are two images, but that we can't understand why there can be two images when we see it, because we have learned that actually there are ducks. And when our mother took us to the parks, where there were no ducks in Venezuela, late in life, I went to probably New York, my first duck. So you learn about ducks, rabbits. There were no rabbits in Venezuela. The first time I saw rabbits was probably in Europe as well. So there are rabbits, but I didn't see them in the city. So we learn rabbits and ducks, and we learn it through our interaction, our language games. So it's strange. The Gestalt example is that there is one physicality, which is one drawing, but two ways of understanding. And the two ways of understanding is there's two ways of the way we have engaged with duck and rabbits. And you're right to point out that this is all a practical turn, because it's all how we engage with the world and how our actions are building a world through the language and the concepts and the language games. I think this is very powerful for humanities. I think this is very powerful for our understanding of ourselves and our communities and construction in social institutions. But you have theoretical knowledge. right? You have signs. And I think this is very different because there is a directionality. So in my example, I made a mistake and I corrected. Yeah, so I made, instead of a cappuccino, I corrected. So you correct your intention. Yes, and you're aiming at the end, and the achievement of the end is what is called the right performance. And that is, let's call it the truth of the practical action, whereas the truth of the theoretical reasoning is defined by the cell, the DNA. So I think these are two ways that the work, and the question is, and this is very important now with the AI research and so on, even technology they have a directionality. If they don't engage with how the directionality of the human being works, they're going to be alienated from each other. And that's the tragedy. It has to serve us. So it has to be parasitic on us. But this is a further deeper reflection. But I think that these are two different ways of dealing with the world. I don't agree that the practical is reducible to the theoretical. The theoretical is also limited by the object. No, and the practical is limited by our rediscovery of the good and the complexity of the good. The theoretical is only when you hit the consequence of your actions. But the beauty of the practical is that we can envisage how this good might not be working. We can only in leading with the action. Yeah. So yes, I think these are two different ways, and I think your question is also with philosophical thinking. Yeah, that is, what is the role of metaphysics and epistemology? Should we do more Wittgenstein and practical philosophy and philosophy of action and less metaphysics? And I think on that, the metaphysical turn in jurisprudence has been to our prejudice, to the other tradition of thinking about the law as a set of aims, things we do, things we practice. And we have a bunch of vocabulary, language, everything. It was a rich tradition. It is dangerous that we reduce that to the metaphysical view. On that, I agree. This is a very dangerous. It is superficial. We lose ourselves. We lose ourselves in action, actually, with no action, because we stop understanding ourselves. Yeah. Thank you. You happy with or you thought about something else? You think that it should be reduced, or one should be subsidiary to the one?
No. I mean, I'm fully satisfied, but I was also wondering while we were answering me, how would you put together the relationship between practical reasoning and theoretical reasoning, or some kind of requirement of some theoretical approach whenever we engage into practical reasoning, at least in some complex contexts, such
absolutely.
as law. Yeah.
Yes, and that comes, the theoretical reasoning plays, as an example with Renato, plays a key role. So the better our science, the better our technology, and that becomes parasitic to where we go, the flourishing of a community, the flourishing of our lives, of our children and grandchildren, of the planet. Yeah. But it's not purely theoretical, and it's not economical. So the political is the most fundamental, and the political and the philosophical, and it's the hardest. And if we don't invest in this in education, you see the collapse of political leadership and everything. Yes. I remember there were in Venezuela some, I'll tell you later because we are recording it. Yeah. So I'll tell you, yeah. It's about politics in Venezuela. I don't want to get in trouble, yeah.
Okay, I have 2 points. First one is, I think you can, I mean, it's just a comment, Veronica, for further conversation. But I think when you're writing, you're giving examples of individual actions.
Yeah.
But you're actually interested in the political.
Yeah.
So one point I would make is that when you give your examples and you talk about the subject or the agent, because of our environment, intellectual environment, we tend to think of the individual. And it would help if you would elaborate, of course, in my point of view, not to think of the individual as we do in the liberal and atomistic tradition, but of the mind. Anyone can think like that. And thinking has this collective dimension. I can only think making use of a language which is not mine, which is always shared in common. Then we go back to Wittgenstein, no way. But I think that's one point that could help a lot your readers to get the point you're making. Because otherwise, people would be confused and think of individual and atomistic agents. That's one point. I mean, it's a comment, as I told you. The other thing is a comment I would make regarding our conversation with Carlos. Reminded me very much of two examples that Anscombe gives her in her book, the intention. But basically, one of the examples is that she's writing something, someone comes into the room and says, "What is she doing?" And the answer would be, "Well, she's making noise on the paper." That is, you have to share the world. Correct. If you take an Inuit who never saw anybody writing, he doesn't know what writing is, doesn't know what a pen is, he will not know what's going on. So you have to have something in common, this shared world, in order to enter any kind of conversation. Otherwise, when you are too far apart, there is a first labor or work of translation, of getting to understand each other. And then that's when you start from the very start. That is, looks like a man, a person, a human being. So something we gotta have in common. So we will build a world in common. But sometimes this world in common does not exist. And in our societies, this happens. There are so many differences. People are living one kind of life, even if they're geographically neighbors or in the same city. They may be, because of the symbolic world in which we live, we may be totally apart, in some respects at least. So I think a good point would be, what is this third person point of view? Well, it's not the observer, it's the universal, but the universal has to be someone who shares something with you. Otherwise, there will be no conversation. I think I would develop that idea. That's it.
Good. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. So in this, okay, you're making a very interesting point about that. I start from the latter point and then they go back for the first comment. So this is good because you're right. In this example, you could argue, but what about, I mean, this is an example of an action. I think in all traditions, we make coffee or a hot coffee, I would say. In all, I think most of the traditions you have a stimulant to the body. So there's a commonality because it's a basic need of a human being. So there's a shareability. But you are making a point, what happened with the character of promises or consenting sexuality, which is very, consenting sexuality is a very, I would say, Western thing, yes? And how we compare that, and those are the most difficult questions with Arabic traditions or Muslims or other religions, right? And how we communicate with that world, this complexity of values. That is, and that's why I think this model works at the beginning within small political communities. Yeah. The other point you're making is more philosophical. And we go back to brute facts. I mean, the same. In the brute facts, Elizabeth Anscombe put examples of the grocer who brings the potatoes. Yeah. And she said, oh, I owe you £5. And if someone is looking at me, they know what promises is by this interaction. But she call it brute facts. That is all the background of the action. If you don't have the background of the action, this is unintelligible. Right. Then your only task has to be the third person perspective. And that's the question of the anthropologist. So that's why, Malinowski or the active participant. So they all in the Samoa Islands, right? You have to live there. You have to participate. Otherwise, you're confused about these shells and the exchange of shells. Hermeneutic, correct. But I'm thinking about how complex, political, difficult questions that we are so attached, like life of children, life of elderly people, sexuality. You can't do that without presupposing certain core things, certain values in the background, certain language, I think, and thick ways of seeing the world. And you can still disagree, but you're disagreeing on something very important, yeah? Or something that really matters, and how we move in the political community towards the other. And that is a challenge, yeah. I recognize that there are hard questions here. And that's why I have chosen things like health, education, that I think is shareable. It's shareable. Yeah, so you're pressing me on something more challenging here yeah. So on the collective, you're right. My worry is also because if you start on the collective, there are two ways of thinking about the collective. You start from the collective, then people do not understand the point of the first person perspective. But if I start from the first person perspective, people think it's an individualist view. So maybe finding a way of saying it's both. It's the first person perspective, and you have a person perspective, and we come in together. And we can't avoid it. That's inescapable. We have to bring it together. And that's why I think this works for the farmer unions, this works for the community, the schools, at this level of the political. And the large, and you see it in all how in Europe, people are incorporated, people coming from so many different cultures, everyone working together with displaced young adults in the UK, working together for their integration. Only, and I have said this in these communities, it's only through this engagement. They have to engage from the first person perspective with their values and our values together. And that is very challenging. Mm-hmm. But I think we have no other choice. Mm-hmm. You're not happy with the latter thing.
No. I just make a comment. You're saying people will engage in the cooperating with these immigrants or whatever. But then, of course, they're engaging because they have something in common. They believe this is important, for instance. And they believe that's important because they come from a certain tradition, as you mentioned. Correct. But because you use a sentence or an expression here in your paper, which is very good. We are thrust into the world. But my point is always, the world we are thrusted in is also symbolic.
Yeah.
It's also historical and cultural.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, one of my favorite philosophers says, we are thrown into a world which already exists, both materially and symbolically. So every one of us has to adapt, but this world is always being built and rebuilt. But then I don't think we are in disagreement. I think we are actually trying to elaborate a little bit more on these points.
Correct. Yeah. And it's axiological. When you talk, it's symbolic, both axiological, absolutely, yes. Another thing, that's why I think the law is so important, you see? But the law has to be powerful, intelligent, engaging with descriptions of actions. And that's why I think the common law is very well equipped to do this, to give the basic protections for integration of immigrants, but also the community has to engage. And there are many associations, foundations, and you see them, everyone working together in the frame, and they have to be aware as well of the legal framework. But the legal framework has this shape of descriptions of values. You can't teach people, oh, these are your rights, and because this is empty for them. They have to understand how the legal decisions work. And I have done sessions with displaced young adults in the UK on this. Yeah. So I have put this in practice. And we have called it the rule of law as a theater. And we have done theaters with them. So there's many ways of exploring. But this was just a way of exploring thoughts. It works in a different way. Mm-hmm.
Professor Eber?
Congratulations for your lectures and for thought-provoking. And
well, it's a luxury to have you here, but you know that.
Thank you.
I didn't expect it. So.
You read the other lecture. The special guest.
Yes.
Yes, indeed.
So I have like 3 reactions to 3 different points.
Yes.
And the first of one, I can see what you're trying to say, but I'm not sure that the way it is written, it's the best one.
Mm-hmm.
So for instance, in page 3,
Mm-hmm.
which corresponds still to the 2.5, the role of principles or rules is justificatory only.
Yeah.
And then you say, and they play no role in guiding or deliberation and action. I can see that it is justificatory only and that they cannot play any further role. So I'm not sure if you are missing the further word, like to suggest that doing the justification is already a role, but it doesn't give another role into that.
Yeah, I said it doesn't play any role in deliberation. And I think that's, I wonder, okay, so this is a good point. So, because I think that deliberation, it's all about the particulars, you see? So they play no role in deliberation. I would say the only role they play is in justification.
Okay, that's what I'm trying to say. That
Okay.
I guess I understand that you want to say the first part, but then the second part of the sentence sounds too strong, and probably you need to make this clarification. So they don't play any further role in guiding or deliberation and action.
Yes, I think yes, it's important that the reader, yes, okay, thank you. But it's clear the point, they don't play a role in deliberation.
I understand what you're trying to say, yeah. I just think that in
because
that sentence,
I wonder whether if you add the further role, sorry. So where is the sentence? Can't find it. Yeah, I wonder, so the role of principal rule is justificatory only, and they play no role.
And then they play no
because
role.
If you say, I wonder, just a question, if you say they play no further role, oh yes, of course, yes, you're right.
Or then they play no role in guiding.
Yeah, no further role.
Or then they play no.
But no, it's. Oh yes, let me check.
Think it through.
Yeah.
I think there's something missing there.
Yeah.
And I can completely see that you're trying to say that it doesn't. The role is justificatory only, and then that you are also willing to say that it plays no role in guiding or deliberation and action. But the connection between the two sentences, I have the feeling that there's something missing.
Okay.
So but that's like a more friendly amendment. On 2.6, that's the one I'm really interested in hearing a little more of you. You say a focus on the idea that the exercise of officials' capacity produces right answers, as opposed to a recognition capacity that recognizes when a procedure has produced the right answers.
Yeah.
So some in the paragraph, it sounds like either or, but I have the feeling that you want to suggest that it does both, and to some extent, it's important that it tries to achieve both parts, or at least that the practical reasoning is enable us to think of the two levels. Do you see what I'm trying to say? The importance of producing right answers, and also the importance of the procedure to produce right answers. But one is substantial and the other is more procedural. So I would like probably to hear if you definitely think that it is an either or you can achieve both.
Yeah. So I'm saying that you don't need a recognition, because the recognition is by and done, but you don't need a procedural recognition.
Okay.
But the only recognition, and I should clarify that, the only recognition is done by your capacity of the skills. So I do not have any procedure to say that I'm speaking incorrect English, I hope, with some mistakes, obviously. I don't need any process to do that. I just know that I'm doing the right thing.
Okay. So the first sentence following that, the title or subtitle, so it sounded like that's where I think it's also, but you're probably saying that someone else is doing both things, and then you can depart from there.
No.
Or
No. The majority of the people think that you have a recognition, you need a recognition capacity. So they don't directly, and what they do is that they immediately, they say,
Okay.
oh, this procedure will give you all the answers. So the exercise of deliberating and its excellent itself, that itself is everything. But someone says, oh, it's, you know, the process will give you the verification. It's very scientific. It's like scientific method when we learn, you know, the research question, the method. And if you get that process right, you get the right answer. The right answer is at the end of the process. I'm saying, no, the right answer and many right answers along the process while we are doing it. And at the end, that's why people think, the main critique of Aristotelian practical reason is that because it relies on the phronimos, on his or her capacities on practical wisdom. And people think that is counterintuitive. And the modern view, we did a little bit of modernity in the second lecture, a criticism of the second lecture, Daniel advanced. The modern view is that you need always a procedure to test, to verify, to get whether you are doing the right thing. That is the vague idea. You think it's it's not very clear here, a bit.
And probably the further elaboration is necessary if it was like where I was lost, like it's not clear to me what you want to achieve with this part.
Yeah.
But I think you're explaining now that you are definitely for the substantive right answers, and you don't believe that you care about the importance of the procedure.
Okay, good. Yeah.
To verify.
Yeah. So let me expand on that. And I like what you say, substantive right answer. That's a correct thing to say. Yeah. So elaborate and unpack this more. I agree. Yes. And I think I have to say that these are kinds of very quick skeleton of the whole development of the book I'm trying to do. So this is just a skeleton, and you're absolutely right. This needs more elaboration as well with Reynaldo's point of where you want to start. Be careful with the start only with the individual. So that helps me to frame the entire development.
Yeah, and I guess you're probably right that it's the way you phrase it in a short paper.
Yeah.
And if it is expanded,
needs more unpacking. Absolutely.
Because I also have a little trouble with your conclusion, the via negativa, that the common good as a grand end is impossible. I guess I can see that if posed in theoretical terms only, and as you have been arguing on the importance of the practical reasoning, so I can see that that's where you're going, but still, I think it is not impossible if we move into a more practical reason. It is impossible if you stick to the theoretical reasoning. So, and I see that's probably one of the tensions we have when we all discuss these things, because I have a feeling that appealing to abstract principles is not necessarily theoretical or only theoretical. I think it goes back and forth from abstract to concrete.
Yeah,
we go back and forth more into the Rawlsian reflective equilibrium.
Yeah,
what we were talking yesterday, the Protestant attitude.
Yeah.
So I think that's
the naturals. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the other thing, because you say, and I agree completely with you, the right cannot be detached from the good. It's misleading and division, because if we do this practical reason, they are always going back and forth and complementing each other. So that's why I was trying to, but I think that's also a matter of viewing, probably in a broader, in the book, it's much more explained or clarified that you are against this because of the theoretical reasoning, sticking into theoretical reasoning.
But I in my review of Vermeux's book, Common Good Constitutionalism, I endorse. I like very much his. I mean, he said it. This is not a treatise on jurisprudence. I'm just a bridge between the people who are doing jurisprudence and the constitutionalists, a constitutional theory. So it's a work on constitutional theory. So I agree with his critique, the problem of the originalist and the problem of the public meaning. And in trying to introduce the idea of the common good. But I say to him there, in my critique, published in the Harvard Law and Public Policy Review,
Okay.
that actually the instead of the principles being at the beginning of his thought, of the thinking of the judge, it is the outcome of a process of deliberation. So I'm saying, for example, in this, we can, the principle has acquired, the principle of the duty of the employer has acquired another interpretation and has another, so you can pose it as a, oh, what I ought to do, oh, and you can put it as a principle of a rule. But this is all parasitic of the particular kind of engagement with the world, with the facts, and with the character of the good. So the principle plays no role in practical reason. That's my argument. And I think that's my disagreement with Vermeule's. So the construction of the common good is as an outcome, the principle. And then you put the principle for the courts. Or the lawyer in his advice is giving to the client, oh, this is the principle. But it's because, and this is similar to the backward and forward looking. The forward looking has been, but the backward looking, you can do the doctrinal work. And that's going to be pulled. But of course, we have the doctrinal work of the reasonable man, of the foreseeability in negligence, and all that makes sense because you have practical reason. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. It's not theoretical. That's the point. I think we agree in many things, but we disagree, I think, on the role of principles. That was our discussion yesterday, no, Emma?
Yeah, I guess somehow in this, but the way you're phrasing it, it also makes very clear the idea that you're only attributing them to principles, the justificatory role exposed.
Yeah.
And but I'm still thinking that the principles are somewhere.
You're right. Yeah,
going back
yeah.
and forth.
And that's your point. I mean, can I? Yeah. So I definitely need a chapter on roles and working, maybe.
Yeah.
Because I can't. Yeah, and that comes again and again. Can you engage with this author? How this is different from this? How this? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because the author comes from a background. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the reader is coming from a different background. They haven't read Anscombe, or most likely, yes. So you're absolutely right, yeah.
Okay, I think.
Well, thank you very much. We are finishing the session.
Yeah. So
Well, I can't
sadly,
thank you
very
all
sadly.
enough for everything. Thank you very much. It's been such a joy. I thought when will we be too much, but I think now it's too short. So I'm missing it already. I'm missing you all, as the Americans say.
So, Professor, really, thank you all the professors who joined, the colleagues, researchers as well. Thank you very much for taking this very long flight to be here and to being so generous with us this week. We really thank it enough. I think, I hope you have enjoyed it as much as we did. So, de los gauchos a la llanera, muchas gracias. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah.